This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. Alright, hello and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a radio show and podcast about things we like but have problems with or are challenging in ways, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome back, I think, the first ever
I was on the first one. Yeah.
That makes you returning champion. I think you get a badge.
Oh, I was hoping for like this big chalice or something.
I'll see if the budget can stretch to a badge. Rob Mildon, welcome back. How's it going?
That's great. Thank you, Hugh. Great to be here.
Fantastic. So the first time that I had you on, we were talking about Auteka. We were a band that I had sort of had peripherally in my awareness, but not paid direct attention to. This time around, however, we're kind of nerding out about something that we both quite enjoy, which is the series Castlevania. So I suppose as a preamble, this is for listeners rather than for you, I kind of don't believe in spoilers. So if you believe in spoilers and you are desperate to be unspoiled, firstly, like, the last season has only just finished on Netflix, but it's been sitting on Netflix like the previous 3 seasons for freaking ages. Go and sort it out.
Yeah, I would say we won't spoil the 4th season because that's the most recent one. But seasons 1 to 3, if you've not seen those yet and you do care about spoilers, stop now.
Yep.
Go watch them. They're awesome, and then come back.
And if you're a person for whom like there is too much stuff and not enough time is a source of reservations about getting into things, I am very pleased to tell you that they are like proper old-fashioned like 20-minute episodes of animated TV, and there's, I forget how many per season, but not that many. So
yeah,
like,
it's the first season only has 4 episodes. It was quite strange to encounter that when that was the only season. I was like, oh wait, what? We're finished already? But so it was kind of confusing and perhaps a bit disappointing. But the other seasons go to the full 10 episodes, or possibly only 8 for some of them.
Point being that we're not saying like go watch all of One Piece. Or all of Naruto, or something like that. Though that would be an unreasonable thing to tell anyone to do. But all of Castlevania is reasonably achievable.
Oh, yeah, definitely. You could knock out the first season in an evening, in a couple of hours, even.
Yeah.
And it's easy to sort of get sucked into the later ones. Get it.
So for people who are completely unfamiliar with it, the really quick rundown is Castlevania was a series of it's probably still an ongoing series of video games, knowing how video games work, but it initially was a video game on like either the first Nintendo or the second. Like, it's quite early in the history of Nintendo, I think. You fight someone who is Dracula, and do they call him Dracula in the games? I think they do.
I think they call him Dracula.
Yeah, you fight Dracula, and the games' claim to fame is that they pioneered an approach where there is stuff that's just completely impassable, and then you find a thing and it makes that area of the game accessible, or you don't die all the time. So it's the idea of like suddenly you'll be able to backtrack and get places you couldn't and fight things you couldn't.
Yeah, the Metroidvania is a whole genre of video game now, taking its name from Castlevania and Metroid.
But fortunately, the Castlevania series basically takes the conceit of man with whip fights Dracula, and aside from that, I think the monster designs are based on like enemies you fight in the game. But aside from that, you need to know nothing about the video game at all.
Yeah, I never played any of the video games. I know basically nothing about them. So if you come to it from a place where you've played the video games, there will be a lot more there for you. No doubt items, characters, designs, music. One of the things I saw people say was, I wish they'd use more music from the game. And to me, that's just did they? Okay, fine. It was cool anyway. So yeah, you don't need to have played the games or know anything about it to get a lot out of it.
Yeah, and like having existed in Western pop culture, understanding of Dracula is also entirely sufficient.
Yes, yeah. There is a lot of the show sort of delves a lot into vampires and the sort of the vampire powers of legend and how they are applied, whether it is enormous strength or flight or being able to turn into a cloud of bats or just sitting and staring brutally at a fireplace. Then it's runs the full.
Well, I mean, and we may as well get into kind of specifics of the show. One of the things it plays around with vampires that I kind of appreciate is that some of them. Lots of them have fantastical magic powers, and all of them have physical abilities beyond the scope of what ordinary humans can do. But one of the other things that they have is just they're phenomenally long-lived. So they, if they're really interested in something, they can just learn the entirety of that one thing. Or if they would like to amass riches, they can just get all of the money because it's easy to do that if you have a functionally infinite time span to make money in. And so there are lots of vampires who exist in that way, where they've got an area of specialization and they've just decided that they're going to spend several hundred years just getting really good at one thing and one thing only.
Now, you'll also see you might be confused initially, is that there aren't very many vampires in the first season. There's Dracula, and that's kind of it. And he's not even really in it. He's just sort of this looming figure of dread come to wreak vengeance upon the humans for the terrible things they've done to him. And so you might be a little taken aback there. It's just these weird sort of creatures with glowing blue eyes. But then in season 2, they just go all in on the vampire cast. You've got Dracula, you've got Viking vampires, you've got Eastern European vampires in that classical mode. They do have other vampires. There's an Indian vampire and there's a Chinese vampire, but they don't have any lines, let alone any names. So that is just kind of weird background padding that they never kind of went into. We're going to have these extra vampires here. There's like a global vampire movement, but some of them we don't think are too terribly important. Yeah, no, I mean, it's in some ways it's sort of a missed opportunity in that it would have been kind of fun to fiddle around with because there's a lot of kind of like setting up a wacky fantasy thing and then digging into its implications for the world and the philosophical implications for the people who live it and all that kind of thing that's in part of the show. And looking at something like vampire myths around the world through that kind of lens could have been kind of fun, but it's also, that's a whole other like seasons worth of stuff that would need to be happening at the same time. Some of those vampire powers are shown briefly, and so you sort of get a quick look at them, but they're never elaborated on. So
can I ask, as someone who was not in any way engaged with the video game and its lore and universe, what the thing was that got you watching Castlevania?
Well, and this is going to get us into one of our areas of reservation. It was written by Warren Ellis. Now, I've been a huge fan of the stuff that he's written ever since reading Transmetropolitan, his sort of magnum opus comic from the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, it's real long, so I think it kind of starts late 90s and bleeds over into early aughts because it just went for so long.
Yeah, but it was just his command of language and his ideas that really sort of grabbed me. And so I read his comics, read his books, and then he's making a cartoon series about vampires. Okay, yeah, I'm in. And this is where we get to, in between Season 3 and Season 4, it was revealed that, again, in the early 2000s, Warren Ellis had been a sex pest and extremely unsavory behavior. And a lot of us went, oh, for goodness sakes, and sort of set our comics aside in disgust.
Yeah, I mean, there's a thing with Warren Ellis where kind of sort of related to the sex pestery and sort of not, but I heard an interview with him where someone was asking him about Transmetropolitan, which has a lot of kind of influence from, in some ways, in reference to Hunter S. Thompson and kind of like the self-made myth of Hunter S. Thompson as opposed to Hunter S. Thompson, the actual guy, in terms of its central character who's called Spider Jerusalem. And one of the things that Warren Ellis said about Thompson in that interview is that he's a very seductive writer. Like, he has this way of kind of bringing you into his viewpoint that makes everything that he says, no matter how outrageous, you're kind of on side with him because something about his grasp of I guess, tone or the way that he characterizes everything that he says kind of gets you on side like that. And I think that's a thing that you could say about Warren Ellis's writing as well.
Definitely. And you're introduced to Dracula's plan very early on, which is that in revenge for the murder of his wife by the church, he decides to annihilate humanity. He's like, you know what? I've had enough. You're not worth anything. I'm going to kill all of you. And the way that the church is presented and the way that his wife Lisa is presented as she's a healer, and because she knows things, this is abhorrent and is burned at the stake. And Dracula goes, "Oh, you guys done messed up," and you're kind of on side with him. You go, "Look, buddy, I get it."
Yeah. And I guess the reason that I thought that was relevant in the context of the sex pestery and various other things is that sometimes if you read an awful lot of Warren Ellis, you notice that there is kind of a stock Warren Ellis viewpoint, and it doesn't necessarily change a lot. And I wonder if that sort of perspective crutch, if you like, is kind of a thing that I'm having difficulty expressing precisely what I'm trying to say, but I wonder if that's a thing that bleeds into a self-perception that let him get away with being a creep for a really long time.
Yeah, it could be.
And that does give me conflicted feelings, because once you have a sense of the Warren Ellis tone, you will notice characters in Castlevania just doing Warren Ellis speeches every so often, and they're just Warren Ellis speeches. There's no other term for them, really.
Yeah, pretty much. The good news is, though, that once you get into Season 2, you become more absorbed with the characters themselves, because there are a lot more of them. Yeah, I mean, fantastic, and they've got some fantastic voice talent to like Peter Stormare as Godbrand, the Viking vampire. Well, I like boats. I'm a Viking. Is brilliant, and I mean, James Callis' really understated work as Alucard. And his playful love-hate banter back and forth with main character and protagonist Trevor Belmont is fantastic.
Who is Richard Armitage. So that's Thor and Oakenshield, most recently from the Hobbit movies that you're listening to being Trevor Belmont.
And interestingly, Dracula is voiced by Graham McTavish, who was Dwalin in the Hobbit movies. So you've got these two old Hobbit buddies facing off against each other. Now, when it came to the revelations about Ellis came out, and I thought, do I watch the fourth season? And then having enjoyed the third season from an animation perspective, the show's more than just its writer. It's all of these animators, and I've ended up following quite a lot of them on Twitter, and they're all, here's the bit that I did, and everyone else is like, oh, this is so cool. And so I watched it for them so that I could see their work. And so I decided not to ditch the whole thing because of something that one person involved in this production out of many had done.
Yeah, and I think while as I was saying, there is kind of a Warren Ellis tone and a Warren Ellis perspective on things. The show it doesn't feel to me like Warren Ellis's badness was a direct result of a sort of political or philosophical standpoint that the show then represents. You know, it's not like reading Atlas Shrugged, where someone who idolized serial killers because she thought that they were the ideal form of manhood then kind of conceptualized that philosophy into a very long novel. And you have to get on board with it in order to get the whole thing. Like, it's not that. Yeah. It's this person who did this cool thing was also doing this deeply uncool thing at the same time.
Yes, which is fortunate. I'm very fortunate to have never read Atlas Shrugged.
No, neither have I. I hear the best recommendation is it makes a very satisfying thump when you throw it at the wall. But of course, in the age of ebooks, that's a less of a thing. So you mentioned the animation, and I think that bears out because it is kind of stellar throughout. And one of the upsides of Warren Ellis as a kind of initiating force for this show is that he has a lot of interests in kind of the stranger and more occult ends of horror. So you start with there's a vampire plot to annihilate humanity, but it gets into like multiverses that you access through psychedelic portals and visual riffs on Neon Genesis Evangelion, and also a lot of, because it's a show about a guy with a whip who fights vampires, there's a lot of very complicated fight scenes, which are always carried off with a sense of like being spectacular but knowing what's going on.
Oh, definitely. The climactic fight at the end of season 2, which has Cypher and Trevor and Alucard taking on a whole castle hall full of vampire mooks and vampire lords, and then culminating with the best vampire on vampire fight since Angel season 5. And there's something essential about a vampire fight. This is where all of these legends and these stories sort of culminate, and they're extremely fast, they're extremely hardy, they have all of their special turn into a bat powers, so you've got that extra angle to combat, and the whole sort of the climactic, and it's an emotional thing as well because Alucard is fighting his father. Yeah,
so I think that's worth mentioning. The characters that we mentioned there. So Trevor is I think the central character of one of the games. He's the guy with whip who fights vampires.
And he comes from a family that's like a long line of monster hunters, and he's the last of his kind. Yada yada.
Cypher is a spellcaster from a people who are spellcasters. And Alucard is Dracula's half-human son who fights with a levitating sword. Again, I don't know about Cypher, but I know that Alucard is the hero of one of the games. But the games, like all long-running game series that started a long time ago, the lore is just spectacularly opaque because it started with basically nothing, and then people just added more and more and more and more and more forever.
It's like trying to understand like a Final Fantasy game, I suppose.
Yeah, or worse, like Kingdom Hearts.
Oh boy!
We thought that Final Fantasy wasn't convoluted enough, so we turned it sideways. And I was going to make that point, like. They do a really great job in that climactic fight between Alucard and Dracula of conveying the emotion of these two characters, largely through the way that they fight each other, because it's not a super talky fight. No,
and there is the odd bit of calling the old man out. I mean, Alucard's terrific line. This whole catastrophe has been history's longest suicide note. Because of course Dracula's doing it because he essentially wants to die. With his wife dead, there's nothing left for him in this world. So if he has to die, then he's going to take all of humanity with him. And although you do spend a lot of season 2 going, he's not very good at this. For someone who's driven to annihilate the human race, he spends a lot of time in his study staring moodily at the fire.
Yeah, and I guess the genius of that is that it kind of turns out that that's the point. Like he's actually not super interested in succeeding.
Because one of the main plot of the vampire side of that story of that season is that all the vampires going, well, what are we doing? Are we annihilating humanity or are we just sitting around? I'm bored.
And I mean that's a surprisingly deep level of analysis, I suppose, or critique about like what do you do when you're part of this enormous machine that has this singular terrifying purpose, but actually the person at the top has just lost it and is not engaged with it at all, and how do you then function? And in a lot of ways, the stuff that happens in the seasons after that, because the grand fight with Dracula happens about halfway through the entire show. That's people dealing with the fallout of how that went wrong and what you do next after that happens.
And that, I think, brings us to what I think are the two most interesting characters on the show, which are Hector and Isaac, who are humans who are on Team Dracula. Like, they have joined the vampires and they are comfortable with his goals because of their own histories. And so they get to exist within that vampire space and are the equals of these vampires, at least in Dracula's eyes, and how they respond to those characters in these situations, and the ways that they adapt. The different ways that they adapt, the extremely different ways that they adapt, when sort of the Dracula's dream is sort of ended and everybody has to go their separate ways. Yeah, no,
I agree with you. I think they are the best characters in the show because they kind of they deal with so many different things over the course of their various arcs. And I guess the first one that I think is quite interesting is that, as you say, they're humans who are on Team Dracula, and Dracula sees them as the equal of the rest of the vampires, but the rest of the vampires don't necessarily.
No, they don't.
And so, I mean, it's the rare case where you could argue that the fantastic element has been used as a way of maybe talking about someone who's in whatever way they're a minority in an institution, and the way in which that they kind of have to deal with proving that they're the equal of everybody else there. And it doesn't, to me at least, come off like the fantasy elements are confusing things.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's quite straightforward. All they've done is escalate it to the point where like the other people in the office can eat you if they want.
Yes, although it's clear that with the esteem that Dracula holds these two in, that at the end Isaac wants to do his last stand with Dracula, and Dracula says, "No, you're basically you're like a son to me. You're going to survive," and throws him through a portal. And then Isaac sort of cracks his knuckles and goes, "Okay, let's see where we can take this." And he has his own goals, and even at one point he says, I can understand why Dracula wanted to do what he did. It's because you're all so damn rude, because people are just relentlessly unpleasant to him for no reason." And he said, "Well, if this is the world, maybe Dracula was right."
Yep. And so I want to continue this conversation specifically about these people, but also we're just about at the halfway point. So we will be back and continue talking in particular about Hector and Isaac right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And you're back. This is Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast on Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. And today I'm talking to Rob Mildon about would you call it's definitely anime influenced, but it sits on that fudgy line like Avatar: The Last Airbender about whether you call it anime. Anyway, Castlevania.
Although it's made by the people who did Adventure Time.
Yeah.
So that is quite a jump.
Anyway, before the break, we were talking in particular about the characters of Hector and Isaac and the ways in which they're interesting. And one of those ways, particularly getting towards the end of the series, I thought was about the kind of the moral and philosophical implications of the night creatures. Mm-hmm. So the reason that Hector and Isaac have this kind of privileged for humans role in the vampire army is that they can create night creatures, which are the monsters from the video game, basically. But they're the kind of shock troops of Dracula's army, and then after Dracula, they're a significant bit of all of the other vampire armies, because...
Just imagine them as like a big hairless werewolf with 4 eyes that glow blue, and they got really big fangs, and some of them fly, some of them are bipedal, some of them go on all fours. They take a variety of forms. They're all uniformly unpleasant.
Yeah.
And
basically the lore is that someone a particular kind of wizard called a Forge Master can make a night creature out of a human corpse. And basically they do a magic on it, and then it turns into a horrible monster that comes in one of a number of usefully color-coded varieties, because video games. But as the series goes on, it becomes clear how the night creatures actually work, which is that a Forge Master is summoning a human soul from hell, and the process of doing that transforms the corpse. The soul is not related to the corpse, it's a different soul. Transforms the corpse into the horrifying color-coded monster, which is then loyal to the Forge Master. But Isaac takes the view at a certain point that he is doing God's work by emptying hell, by filling Earth with night creatures.
So he stops to have, at some point, a philosophical conversation with a named night creature, well, fan named, I think, Fly's Eye. So it's a creature that has the head of a fly, and the fly wonders, I was in hell, now I'm out. What does that mean for my soul? Am I saved? What's going on? And so, sort of Isaac's like, sure.
Which, I mean, lots of shows would be content to say we have an endless army because we can reanimate corpses as monsters and leave it as that. And the fact of going that step further, I think, is one of the real strengths of this show. Stop to sort of really to dive into it. And at the same time as Isaac is doing that, Hector is kind of having the inverse
that because he has fallen under the power of a vampire called Lenore. Like in season 2, there's a big vampire boss called Carmilla, and she's from some other place in Eastern Europe, and she is part of a cabal of vampires who are all 4 very, very different characters. And Lenore is sort of the young and innocent looking vampire, and she plays upon those traits that she has in order to try and earn Hector's trust. And she does, but she's still a vampire, and with all that implies, and the way that story thread goes is kind of shocking, really, sort of at the end. But then you sort of have to ask yourself, well, what did you expect? Yeah,
no, it's quite grim. But I think Camilla's coterie, for want of a better term, is another good jumping off point, because this show pulls a trick which I've seen in some other places, and I really like it when you manage to land it, but it's a tricky one to land, which is that it manages to set up a set of protagonists and a set of antagonists, and have you be more or less equally invested in all of them. Dracula's a bit of a kind of force of nature, and also the fact that his heart's not in it and he's intending to die kind of becomes the point. But Carmilla's lot are all very different characters, as you say, and they're all quite fun to spend time with, and you're kind of rooting for at least some of them. And even Carmilla, who eventually becomes pretty much totally monstrous, kind of has a point.
Yeah, I mean, Carmilla really, she's like, what's the point of annihilating humanity? I just want to conquer them. She goes full megalomaniac, but it does quite well to keep a lid on it. And then you've got Lenore with her intensely personal interest in Hector, and then over on the other side you've got Striga and Morana, and Striga is like a massive barbarian of a vampire, and she has a cool suit of armor that can resist daylight, a honking great sword, wild hair, gigantic muscles, and she and the other one, Morana, who is sort of more of a scholar, are genuinely in love and sort of try to maintain that relationship in between all of the various scheming and violence that Carmilla sends them out to do, which is one of those like it's an odd couple kind of thing, but you still root for them.
Yeah, and that the thing with so. If people have listened to all of the episodes, you should listen to all of the episodes. Ages ago, I had a conversation about the series Berserk, and the central thing about Berserk that I really like is that they have this really interesting conception of demonhood. Like, a demon is someone who has decided, because of something about themselves, that they can sacrifice the person that they love most to the screaming horde of other demons in order to get ridiculous superpowers. But it's that choice that makes you a demon. And there's a similar thing that goes on with Carmilla's coterie in particular. Like, because you get time with them and they get a chance to explain themselves, you get a really good sense of where their particular skill sets and obsessions come from and how they've ended up being the particular kind of monsters that they are. That's a very sneaky trick, because it can make people simultaneously terrifying and quite sympathetic.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think to sort of zoom in on that's nowhere more demonstrated than in the Lenore-Hector relationship, if you want to call it that, or the dynamic between them.
It's a relationship of a sort
that develops during that season, and that we're really sympathetic to Hector for his perspective, where he's come from, and the things that have happened to him, which at that point are quite terrible. And here is this other figure who's apparently sympathetic to him, but we also know she's a vampire and is capable of sort of manipulations that are
and that her specialization is diplomat. So her job is getting people on side and making them do stuff they didn't think that they wanted to do.
And Hector does it.
Yep. Yeah, no, and you can watch, you can watch the pieces be set up and then knocked down, and she's in, and at the same time she explains how she ended up in the position of being the diplomat of the group, because it's never quite made clear what the mechanics of it are, I don't think, but vampires do start as human in this world, and then become vampires, and usually the circumstances that led to that have something to do with the way that they end up heading. And Lenore has this whole thing about, being, I think, stuck as the youngest in this intensely political family and having to work out how to survive without any of the obvious advantages of like strength or menace.
Yeah, it's also getting people to take her seriously, because she looks a lot younger. I don't know how old she's. I can't remember if she mentioned how old she's meant to look.
I think a lot of that stuff is kind of hand waved on purpose, just because the idea is just vampires are real old.
Yeah. Except this one, she's real old, but also she looks really young, so people sort of will dismiss her abilities for this reason. But yeah, she embodies the way that the vampires can be a threat in a different kind of way. You can see Godbrand and his friends go in and lay waste to a village. You can see Striga put on her daylight-proof armor because the local humans have chosen dawn as a good time. They go, they're pretty smart. Too bad I've got this armor. And then she absolutely dismantles them.
Oh yes, and if you're a Berserk fan, the bit where she fights off all the humans wearing the day armor is, to my mind, a pretty solid guts riff, and it's a lot of fun to watch.
Which is, I guess, where we get to another one of the reservations, is the show can be stupendously violent.
Oh yeah, if you do not like seeing people dismembered in pretty graphic detail, you will have a hard time with fair chunks of it.
Yeah, especially early on, like in the first season, they really focus upon Dracula's revenge falling upon these small innocent communities, and with all that entails, with night creatures rampaging through the streets and devouring people and what have you. And then later on, it tends to be vampires going, I'm bored, and going off to drain a village dry of all its blood. And then occasionally, Striga doing her thing. But also there's a lot of monster dismemberment, like when Trevor and Cypher really get going and unlock some magic items and some new powers, then they did dish it out as well. And
and actually, I mean, there's the violence, and also one of the ideas that the show lingers on is that the vampires don't have a monopoly on evil. And so they introduce the Count Saint-Germain as a character. It's this
voiced by Bill Nighy. Like, they got Bill Nighy for this, and he's terrific.
Yes, he's great. But he's a sort of wizard adventurer in the sense of like that period of history where you could make a living by being a sociopath who could speak several languages and just moving from one court to another, selling them the secret to turn lead into gold over and over and over again. As
he says at one point, these questions like, why were you talking to Cypher and Belmont? He says, well, I'm very famous, you see. They wanted to talk to somebody who'd seen toilet paper.
The point is that he goes through an entire arc of making really awful choices.
Because he's got a goal. He's got one goal, and he's laser focused on that, and the devil take everybody else around him.
Exactly.
Literally.
A central bit of the season 3, which is right on the edge of our threshold for spoilers, involves a literal kind of Cthulhu cult type demon cult, who again humans willing to sacrifice stupendous numbers of other humans, and it turns out that the guy who's opposing them is also a completely different kind of human monster. So you get a lot of human darkness as well, along with your your vampires.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of a good examination, especially when you split up those storylines. And so in season 3, you've got your vampire darkness, and with the Alucard takes in the 2 refugees plot, you've got the human darkness of one kind with Isaac rather, and then you've got Cypher and Trevor confronting the sort of that different kind, that weird, oh, look, cultists.
Yeah, and actually the Alucard and refugees plot it's real bleak.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Because it's very much kind of an examination of like the limits of empathy, or the limits of one person's capacity to kind of open-heartedly help other people. For reasons which, in terms of what ends up happening with Alucard and those guys, like they're largely out of his control, but also the shitty things that people decide to do to him make a lot of sense from their point of view as well.
Yeah. Season 3 is by far the bleakest in terms of outlook and the things that the characters go through. As Trevor said, says to Cypher, for the last 2 months we've been living your life, adventures and victories. Now we're living my life. As things are burning and everything is grim and it rains.
Yeah, and do they introduce the underground? No, the Underground Kingdom is season 4. So I think the city with the royal family hidden underground.
Yes,
season 4. So off limits because it's shiny and new. But yeah, there's some pretty bleak looks at power structures and the things that people do when they get their hands on them.
But also you get characters like the captain. Isaac goes out into the world with this tremendously jaundiced view of humanity. Obviously he thinks that Dracula was right. As you said, everybody's just so damn rude all the time. And then he meets the captain, terrifically voiced by Lance Reddick, who is polite and sort of genuinely interested in why Isaac is doing what he's doing. And you can sort of see Isaac going, maybe it's not all bad. As the captain freely admits, you could have killed me at any point, but weirdly you haven't. And that intrigues me. And Isaac is pretty much, well, it intrigues me too.
Yeah. And Isaac's journey is quite interesting because he ends up being put in a situation where he needs to, well, I think someone essentially gives him a fetch quest for a magic item, but it puts him in conflict with like yet another monstrously powerful human who's decided to be a monster. Like it's a wizard who's enslaved an entire city. And you kind of get to see him have the wheels turn through the process of watching like crazy fantasy battles.
Yeah, and you end up with, in season 3, probably scale-wise the biggest battle of that season, because, and Trevor and Cypher's battle is very small scale and very personal, and it's animated that way, like really sort of, I don't know if rough is the right word, the very liney. Anime people will know what I'm talking about.
I would say rough or maybe loose. It reminded me that the other thing that I'd been watching at the same time, in fact, for a conversation on this very show, was One Punch Man. And one of the things about One Punch Man is for entirely different reasons and for different creative purposes, but they lean really hard into the kinds of distortions that are already in anime.
They tend to do it for comedy.
Yeah, they do, but also they'll do it like if you froze a frame in the middle of a fight scene in an ordinary anime, you might see someone look a bit weird just because you need this like weird bendy pose in between normal frames.
Oh, yes, definitely.
To make the animation look smooth.
I've seen it discussed with the way they do it in Naruto as well. It just, that guy's neck is like,
yeah.
But it's human body completely incapable of that, but it adds something to the animation that would otherwise be a bit flat.
What they'll do is in One Punch Man is that they will they will like exaggerate that and hang on to it for more frames, so you can see someone warping out of shape to deliver a big punch, and or something like that. And Castlevania does similar stuff, like they'll deliberately break up the line work to make things more expressive and weirder looking, but they'll also like give you super weird points of view or stretch things or distort them so that the fights become more expressive.
Yeah, typically if Sci-Fi is making a lot of fire, or if Trevor is in the middle of some big explosion as he's wielding his Morningstar thingy, and then the camera sort of spins around and zooms in. Yeah, it's sort of fascinating, and it looks simple, but it would have been just as much work as all the rest of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I said at the start, which I think is maybe a good place to come back to, because we're kind of close to time, is that as well as being super interesting, I found this show incredibly well made, in the sense that when you have a fight with 5 million things happening at once, it can be really easy for that fight to start taking place kind of nowhere in particular.
Yeah.
And it can also be really easy, and I think Castlevania partly gets out of this by being quite short, but it can be really easy for like there to be an endless cycle of like new enemy, new ability, new enemy, new ability that ratchets power levels up in a way that's quite difficult to maintain interest in.
Yeah, thankfully this is avoided.
But even when they're fighting like a castle full of 500 vampires, you kind of feel like you know where people are and what they're trying to do, not just watching them make cool fire.
Yeah, because the season 2 spends a lot of time within Dracula's castle itself, and so in that front entrance hall, you get a good sense for what is there in terms of architecture, and then in the other locations in the castle further up, here's Dracula's study, here's Alucard's bedroom, and connected by a variety of things. And so everything just sort of makes sense within the context of that fight, especially the early bit where everybody's going hell for leather against this horde of mooks and these vampire lords, which is it's probably the best fight in terms of, as you say, clarity of what's going on, and also badassery on display.
Yeah, I would say so. And one of the best examples of that sort of like large scale mayhem actually making some sort of coherent sense that I think you will probably find in anime, probably.
Oh, I don't watch that much of it. But.
Well, let me make a bold assertion, and we will,
okay,
see if people get mad at us or not.
It is decided.
Yeah. Well, look, we're getting pretty close to time. There are two things that I like to do by way of wrapping this show up. The first one is if people have watched Castlevania and thus tuned in to hear what we had to say about it, or maybe they haven't, but this description sounds fun to them and they want other things as well. Are there other things that you would recommend as well?
If you enjoy Castlevania, not 100% sure. In terms of animated shows, no, nothing springs to mind, although you might like other media like comics such as Kill 6 Billion Demons, which, have you mentioned that on the show?
I have not, and that's probably a subject for an episode.
Yes,
because,
definitely.
While my reservations for it are limited, like it's a thing where there is a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And that can be its own kind of reservation. I would say Kill 6 Billion Demons would definitely scratch some similar itches.
Because it's got that clear action in defined locations. And another similar webcomic to Kill 6 Billion Demons, which has that very clear sense of what's going on at all times, even though the action is very frantic, is something called 10 Earth-Shattering Blows.
Right.
Which is like What If Mad Max, but in a fantasy world.
Okay.
And you go from there. And there's massive chase scenes with dozens and dozens of characters and stuff going on, but you're never confused about who's where.
The thing that I would maybe pitch people is if you're down for ultra violence and a cast of more or less equally engaging protagonists and antagonists, maybe check out Dorohedoro, which is also on Netflix. That's actual anime, so it's in Japanese unless you want to watch it dubbed.
And has some really sort of fascinating ideas about magic and the role of it.
I think I'm going to have to find someone to do an episode on that entirely, because there's a lot in Dorohedoro. But just as a short, like if ultra violence with engaging characters,
including the villains, they do that thing where the villains, the anti-villains, it's hard to say sometimes. There are some definite villains and some people who, but you're just as invested in them as you are in the goodies, as it were. Yeah,
no, I do not want anything bad to happen to Noi, despite all of the many reasons they probably should. So I would recommend checking out that as well, and that has the added advantage that the music in Castlevania is pretty great. The music in Dorohedoro is insanely great.
It's just that I watch the opening credits every single time, and they change the end credits music and animation, but the opening credits music is an absolute banger.
Yeah, and completely deranged.
Yeah,
if you're
did I take some mushrooms before I watched this?
If you're used to anime music, it will give you a fright in a good way. Cool. Well, thank you very much. Do you have things to plug of your own?
Things of my own to plug?
Or, just other things that you think people should pay attention to?
If I had to, I think I've already made some recommendations along that. If you're a role player, try playing something other than D&D.
Yes, do that. And in fact, on that note, there is a person who was a regular Warren Ellis collaborator, I believe, called Kieran Gillen, who has a comic and also role-playing system, because it's a comic about a role-playing system, sort of, called Die, which is out in the world at the moment. And
Die the noun, not die the verb.
But I have seen some pages from the comic. I have heard the concept of the role-playing game described. Both of them sound super fascinating to me. So maybe go hunt down Kieran Gillen and see what he's up to.
Yeah, I've read the first two trade backs of that comic and can confirm it's really interesting and quite a treat for the eyes as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Rob.
No, my pleasure, Hugh.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.